Hello and welcome. I'm Tafara Gadamu. I met my guest Phillip LeBel back in 2008 to talk about what actually influenced him to become what he is today, an academic. Well, Phillip came to Ethiopia in 1965 to serve as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ndibir, then a remote location south of Addis Ababa, now barely a 3 hours drive. There he became a teacher and later helped write a textbook for the Ethiopian Ministry of Education.
I was 22 years old when I started all of this, went to Ethiopia in January 1965. I went as a teacher. I knew that I wanted to go to Africa. I had not been there before. I was interested in this continent. I learned just a little bit about it. The choices were Senegal, where one of my friends went, to work in a rural health program, and then it was teaching history in Ethiopia. And I thought that the history option was more challenging, and that's really the motivation that lay behind that. And we flew a TWA flight from New York to Madrid, and it was at Madrid that we caught an Ethiopian Airlines flight. And I have to tell you, that was magical. Getting on this airplane, this Ethiopian Airlines airplane, and having the stewardesses dressed up with their shama, and they would have the little candies and so forth, and talking Amharic for us was just, it was magic to see that. If you look on the inside of the airplane, they had scenes on the wallpaper design of the plane, of the Ethiopian countryside, which just, it was wonderful to see that. And I think they even had Amharic inscription along with English inside the seats for various kinds of things. So that for us was wonderful because we've been trained to read Amharic. We've been trained to write a little bit of Amharic as well as to speak it. So to see that here was this language, this culture in action, and here we are in the airplane was just, it was a thrill to do that. And so when we took our flight from Madrid to Addis, part of it was overnight as we're flying. But I do remember in the morning circling around Addis and then seeing little villages in the countryside and looking down out the window at, this is January, still very green fields and patches of lands with little houses dotted, and then slowly coming into Addis. And then touching down at Bole Airport, the smells of incense and eucalyptus, which you begin to smell as soon as you get there. Again, this was exotic to us because we'd said something like that ever in our travels before. And it was part of the romance of going to this strange place. We were taken by bus to the Old Itigi Hotel, and I stayed at something at that time was called the Pension Gondar, which actually was a French-speaking place. It had nothing to do with my French background, but just by coincidence. And there I think we stayed probably for maybe a little over a week. And it was at that time that the final selection process was made, where you would be assigned. Now, I have a bit of French in my background, so my attraction to Senegal is a natural one, and so I was looking for ways in which I could utilize my French language skills in Ethiopia. And so one of my first places was to go to Diradawa. That was one of my first choices because I knew that there was a French-speaking community there. But I was approached by some volunteers who already had gone to Mdibir and said, well, there's a local French-speaking Ethiopian priest. His name was Abba Francois Marcos, and he was a very influential community leader. And because he spoke French, that sort of also helped to cement the appeal for me. So with another volunteer, we then went down to Mdibir. All of this time I was in the same village, which was Mdibir in southwest Shoa. It's 200 kilometers from Addis Ababa, and it's one of those places that then was considered one of the more remote locations in Ethiopia. It had no running water, no electricity, and you could only get into the village in seasonal travel by a vehicle. Then you had to walk out or ride a mule in the rainy season. For a while, we stayed at a local mission church, and then where I wound up living was in a traditional Ethiopian saddleback. And we modified it. I say we modified it in that we put a cement floor in. We had a little shintabate built on the outside, and I made all kinds of little, what I call appropriate technology conveniences in the house, opening up windows and putting screens in them and things of that sort. And basically, I solved all of my technology needs when I was there. In other words, I had a wonderful existence that served all the needs that I have in the absence of all the gadgetry that we think is so necessary for our existence today. As a child, I had a great aunt on this part of Maryland who would travel to see her relatives, and we would travel on a dirt road out to see them, and they lived in a house that had electricity, but they had a wooden stove and they had an outhouse. And while that was not a commonplace technology, let's say growing up as a child in the 40s and the early 50s, the fact that it was there, the fact that I had seen this at first hand, meant that for me, living in a remote village in Ethiopia was less of a cultural shock and transition than somebody who would be living in Washington, D.C. or New York City or Chicago or someplace. When I went to this village, they had very few textbooks that were available. And one of the ironies that I would state even today is that they used, I think it was Jones and Monroe, was a textbook that was available through the Ministry of Education that had been published in, I think, 1935 or something. I read that very carefully, and at the end of it, it provided an apologia for the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. And to me, that was incomprehensible that this could be part of the curriculum. That they would say that, oh, somehow Mussolini had a case to invade Ethiopia. It didn't make any sense to me. So one of the things that I began doing when I was there was writing preliminary textbook materials. And that was part of the reason why I stayed in Ethiopia as long as I did. I still have these. These were mimeographed stencil sheets. And what I did is I started off teaching 9th grade history. And as I told you, that was, it would be January 1965. So I began with that 1 year. And then in the 10th grade, I started for the next year. And then the next year, it was the 11th grade, and finally the 12th grade. So my reason to stay, for example, as a contract teacher is because I was motivated to basically follow the Ethiopian history curriculum from the 9th grade all the way through the 12th. At one point, I was in an informal conversation to have this published as preliminary history texts with Oxford University Press. It would not have been the final version, but I felt it was important that Ethiopia have text materials that were appropriate to its own curriculum standards, which had a wonderful framework, which was a concentric ring of knowledge around Ethiopia first, and then Africa second, and then thirdly the rest of the world, and so that you could see simultaneously different parts of the world contemporaneously in terms of a given time period. So I thought that was beautiful, and that was a part of my what I call profound motivation for wanting to stay as long as I did. We got involved in certain school improvement projects. We were able to get some money from USAID. So one of the projects that we got involved with was building a community library. We decided to dignify the library by making it a salary. So we had a large library built. It could seat 70 students at a time. And I remember with rudimentary tools building a card catalog case, building a stand for the Shama, not the Shama, but the Petromax lamps that would be used in there, and in building screens for the windows and that kind of thing. So we were very proud of that. It got some play. Another thing that we had was there was a community Shintabate for the school. So we had that built. Another thing that we did is we built, or we upgraded the science laboratory. The science laboratory, again, remember, no running water. So we had a gravitational water flow system. And we built these, using the old Noog cans, which were the korokoro, they were tin cans. We would clean them out, and they would have spouts attached to them, and they would drain water with pipes. We had butagaz gas lamps that would work, for using gas in chemistry experiments. And also there was something called an intermediate technology handbook. And I remember making miniature microscopes for the school children. These would take baling wire, perforate a hole, make an L-shaped wooden design, and create an eccentric piece of turning wood that would raise and lower the resolution using glass grommets that are used for chemical experiments. And so you would have something like a 25 power magnification microscope. We must have made 70 or 80 of these. Right? These were cheap to make. So we cranked them out so that the school children will all have these. So when you had a science lab class, every school child had a microscope to work with, and they would have to share on the gas jets, that sort of thing, but it wasn't as overcrowded as might otherwise be the case. If you look at the educational pyramid, when you start at the elementary school, you had an almost equal proportion of girls and boys. As you go up the pyramid, girls just don't continue up the ladder. So very few of them were up in the upper secondary school. And part of this was just the cultural reticence on the part of parents that a daughter would be so well educated with somehow the notion she would still remain in the community. And so it would raise the probability that the daughter would also leave. And that was very, very divisive for the parents a lot of times. They wanted to have at least their daughters nearby. They might tolerate having the son go someplace else, but you could see that there was a discouragement of sorts, not always spoken, but implicit, about the girls not going ahead and just being educated on their own as much as the boys. At the age of 22, I was eager, bright-eyed, and knew nothing about where my future would take me. I was interested in learning about the world. I certainly fell in love with Ethiopia and its culture and loved learning about it. The longer I stayed there, the more I knew that teaching was a vocation that I wanted to pursue. And so what I wound up doing was thinking, would I go to graduate school and in what? There were some recruitment efforts by school boards in the United States to appeal to Peace Corps volunteer teachers to come and teach in various inner city communities in the United States on their return. I thought about that for a little bit. And then I thought about my own background that I had with economics. I had majored in economics. I finally decided to go to graduate school in economics. And when I shopped around, I wound up taking the GRE examination in Addis, and so I was accepted for admission to Boston University with a fellowship, and that's what decided. I was admitted to other places, but this was the best arrangement because Boston University had an African Studies program, and at that point I knew that however I continued with economics, I wanted it to sort of be able to relate to what I had been going through by living in Ethiopia all this time. I was looking for something that would have an African Studies flavor to it, and Boston University had a well-known program in African Studies. So while I was there, I was able to take some courses that related to African Studies. There was not African economics, but African Studies in conjunction with studying economics in graduate school. I just enjoyed teaching, and that was an act of discovery. I had no idea if I would like teaching or not when I went to Ethiopia, because I'd never taught before. Having lived in Ethiopia, having worked with students and a curriculum for several years, that was inspirational to me to say, I like this, I want to pursue it. It reflects my curiosity to learn more things, and so I wanted to be in an environment where I could do more things. You know, among that list of things that I could have done is that I had overtures made to me by some local bank officials back in Maryland, and they said, you know, well, you can be a lending officer or something like this. I don't regret having turned those down and going into the Peace Corps, for example, because I've just led a much more interesting life by the kind of exposure to international cultures and environments that I'm pretty sure I would not have had if I had just stayed in, say, working for some local bank or some kind of a vocation like that. So I had a broader perspective as a result of that, and I wanted to use that by pursuing my graduate work in economics. While I was in Ethiopia, and I had met Richard Pankhurst, and I described to you a little of that experience, I wrote an article for the Journal of Ethiopian Studies on Garagi architecture. You know, I told you I love these houses. This article, which was published in 1969, was before I went to graduate school, but it reflected, I guess, my engagement with looking at the use of vocabulary and terminology from Amharic and the local language and rendering that into English about the various stages and aspects of these traditional Ethiopian houses. Even when I was in graduate school, I wrote another article for the Journal of Ethiopian Studies. It had nothing to do with my studies in economics now. These are just like sidetrack issues on basically historical documents and narratives and local traditions on the origins of the Garagi people. Because while I was in Ethiopia, again, you asked me what I want to do in my life, I would interview students and I would say, tell me about where you came from and tell me about your parents and all that. So I knew a little bit about the geographic origins of some of my students, where they had come from. I integrated that with what I had read formerly by going to the Institute of Ethiopian Studies on the background of these students, and that was a second article that was published in 1974. So that was my interactions with people like Richard Pankhurst that, as I say, influenced some of my engagement, if you will, with an academic career. When you say, how else did this influence me? Clearly, when I came back from Ethiopia, I had this exposure to a world that the people with whom I came into contact in the United States, for many of them, I could have come from Mars, because it was almost unrelatable to them, incomprehensible to them, that how would I have gone and lived in a small village with none of these conveniences. There was no running water, no electricity, those kinds of things. And as I said, to me, it was not a shock. It was something that I adapted to fairly readily, but they could not conceive of that as an experience that would relate to them. So I carry this interest in other cultures with me in my professional life, and I guess what I have done over the years is that the people with whom I have been able to relate and interact are people who share that kind of exposure and experience, for whom it was a transformational experience. So it's meaningful for them as it has been meaningful for me. And so I'm in touch today with former students as well as former volunteers. You know, some of the students who were in that village, not that I would give you a laundry list of this, but one of them is a pediatrician working in Florida. Another is an ABD in economics teaching at University of Gainesville in Florida. Another one was information technology director for a major commercial bank and living in Texas. Another one is executive officer of a technician working for the Transit Authority in New York City. And, you know, I feel somehow I had maybe some impact on freeing them, empowering them to make the most productive use of their lives. I would never say that because I was there, they did this. I don't think that's fair. I think what is most fair is opening up the opportunities for them to realize their own potential, and that was the critical thing. And many of them did. If there's a sad part to that, it is that they're here and they're not in Ethiopia. I started something called CERAF, the Center for Economic Research on Africa, which was based at my parent institution where I've been affiliated, which is Montclair State University. And each year, I started to have a one-day conference on a theme relating to Africa's development problems. And I would invite representatives from the IMF and the World Bank, the Ford Foundation, or some private organization, UNDP, USAID, to talk about that subject. And then I would publish the proceedings. The motivation behind this was what I would call a nonpartisan commitment to broadening the understanding of Africa's problems to a primarily American audience. And so it was an educational function. I started about the same time also publishing research monographs, like working papers. And through the context that I had, I would publish some of these in French and some in English. And after a while, we now have 75 of these that have been put together, and we have 9 conference proceedings. So that was one of the ways in which this experience in Ethiopia influenced my life professionally in terms of the things that I've done.